Asking and answering questions of ethnic difference are a social taboo in the 21st century West, even if the mythology of racial difference is implied in many of its ideologies, behaviors, ahistorical interpretations of the past, and media exports. Ethnic distinctions have historically been studied upon the non-white world, by the white world, and it's important to understand that history before it is discussed further. Often the inception of racial thinking is pinpointed as birthing from the economic incentive of Europe's global expansion and the resultant slave trade, dehumanizing a source of cheap labor that could be tortured and worked to death on the plantations of the New World, stripped of their own indigenous populations by the violent genocide so often perpetrated by the white man. However, the emergence of these notions of anti-blackness have been pushed back by PhD researchers such as Cord Whitaker, author of Black Metaphors, to at least the European Middle Ages, with roots in the medieval reception of classical antiquity. What we now refer to as the Crusades, a series of barbaric religious maraudings by fanatical thugs, fantasized by modern ahistorical perceptions and glorifications of Middle Ages Europe, sought to rid the Moorish civilizations of their seats of power in the Moorish kingdoms of southern Europe, stripping of that land the innovations brought about by those North African and Arab dynasties. These crusades, whilst often glorified by the alt-right, a manifestation of their own ethno-religious hatred of today in the past. It was in fact, just like the alt-right today, Caucasian male hooliganism left unchecked. Taken from Black Metaphors, Whitaker elucidates, while Geraldine Heng devises the term cultural fantasy in order to address textual manipulation of cannibalism and other violations of horrific taboos in which crusaders took part, the term is equally well suited to address alt-right violations of cultural taboos, namely the movement's commitments to white supremacy and violence, both digital and physical. For the alt-right, the European Middle Ages is a golden age of white racial homogeny. It is an age to whose mores the movement regularly argues US and European societies ought to return. It is also a fantasy era organized around the notion of white innocence, from the social innocence of an era in which feudalism amounted to a system of inviolable castes, in which everyone knew their place and was happy with it, to a prevailing sense of victimhood in which all non-whites are aggressors and all whites are blameless victims. This age is a fantasy. An entire historical period has been co-opted into the mirages of white innocence and black criminality that comprise the mirage of racial difference. The Crusades simultaneously stripped Spain of the innovations contributed by the Moors, whilst also piggybacking on those skills to launch the European global expansion that not only expanded the physical colonial presence of the European Caucasian, but expanded the mythology surrounding that identity, a manifest destiny and white man's burden, which, like the Crusades, was a burden of unrepentant bloodshed. This emerging identity relied on the dehumanization of the other, the antithesis of the white, the black. The incentive for this mythology of whiteness is often regarded as economic, which it was partially, reducing the indigenous black African to a state of inferiority to justify the barbarism of the slave trade, especially in the face of the performative Christianity of the European world and biblical scripture that professed the innate sanctity of all humankind in the eyes of the Judeo-Christian God. This racial pseudoscience, motivated by hatred, financial gain, and manifest through gross intellectual dishonesty and the intellectual frailty of those that it sought to benefit, has resulted in the racial hierarchy of our modern world, ordered in its proximity to whiteness, placed at the top of the hierarchy, and contrasting proximity to the black social group, placed at the bottom. That proximity most often designated by concentrations of melanin possessed by any said group within the hierarchy. The laughability of the single African race to which we all belong, divided up by the egotistical mission of an East African descended sub-melanin offshoot, that for some reason that those melanin deficient people will have to look inwardly to discover, wants to carve an identity for itself, away from its true self.